is not nearly as hard as it might sound at first. So for the compiler code base, this is the way that the source code breaks down. For the Rakudo compiler, of the 26,000 lines that are there, about over half of those lines are written in Perl 6, either as NQP code, which is Perl 6 syntax on top of various runtimes, or literally Perl 6 code itself. Most of the core libraries for the compiler are written in Perl 6. So once we get NQP working in Perl 6 in the compiler, then that's what's there, what is left to do. The parent-specific parts are, of course, these parts that are listed here as peer. And we've been rapidly whittling that down. When I gave a talk similar to this a couple of months ago, that number was 11,000 lines of code. It's now down to 9,000 lines of code. So we're rapidly reducing the amount of peer that we have to have in order to build a compiler. And same for the C code. We're able to get rid of a lot of C code, too, as we make improvements. So this was up at about 4,000 lines before, and now we're down to 3,800 lines. So we're very rapidly reaching the bootstrap phase where we can do most of the things we need to do in Perl 6 itself. So talking about release schedule and what it means to be a distribution release versus a compiler release. As I see it, the Rakudo project, Rakudo is kind of an umbrella name for us now. And it stands for the different pieces that we are working on. Right now in the Rakudo product line, we have two items. So one of them is the compiler itself. The other one is the Rakudo Star distributions, which just started up last week. Both will continue with time-based release cycles. Time-based release cycles is something that we borrowed from the Perl project. It had great success there, I think, and we've emulated that for Rakudo. What that means is that we do monthly releases. And that's different from the way Perl 5, prior to 5.12, used to do things, or I should say prior to 5.11. It used to be that in Perl, you would do a release when you had a certain number of features gathered together that seemed to make sense for a release. And what that often turned out to is you had a release when the pumpkin had time to package it all up and declare that there was a release. But in Parrot and in the Rakudo world, we do monthly releases, which says that on a certain time every month we cut a release with whatever we have. And that's going to be the release. So if we didn't do anything that month, then that month's release will be the same as the previous one, although that never happens in practice. And each release has a release manager. So instead of having one person who's responsible for all of the releases, we've distributed it out so that every month a different person does that. That has several very big advantages. One of them is that nobody gets burned out making releases because it can be a very boring process to cut a release. And so if you have to do it every month, then pretty soon you burn out and say, oh God, it's time to do the release again. But secondly, we also increase our bus number quite a bit so that we're not dependent on one person for being able to make the releases. We have a lot of people who can do it and who can step in at any point at any time. So the first 14 releases of the Rakudo compiler were part of the Perl repository, which is where we got the monthly release process. In early 2009, we split out from the Perl repository and created separate ones. And so this is the release schedule that we had for that. What you should take from this particular slide is that, first of all, the releases are very, very regular. We time the Rakudo compiler releases relative to the Parrot releases. So whatever day Parrot releases, we release 2 days later. Each release we give a code name. We've been naming all of the compilers after Perlmunkers groups. And so if you want to have a compiler released after you, then have your Perlmunkers group get together and do something nice for Perl 6, and we'll name a release after your group. And the far column shows who actually did the release. And you can see I did the first 5 outside of Parrot, and then last year turned it over, and I've only done 1 since then. And I might not ever do one for again, so as long as I can find other people. We are looking for release managers. If you're interested in doing a release, it's really easy to do. The instructions are just step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this. And it only takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours, I think, is the amount. I see people who've been doing the release say, yeah, that's about right, so that's good. So it's really easy to do, and there's lots of people around who can help. There's a lot of people around who've done releases to be able to help. So the Rakudo Star releases, as I said, are a separate product line. Okay. And it's a distribution release, and so they will have their own timeline of release cycle and release workers. One of the questions I haven't had a chance to ask the team that I thought of this morning as I was putting this together is, well, first of all, I should say that for the first few months, I expect Rakudo Star to also have monthly releases. The reason for having monthly releases is that I expect we will fix bugs that quickly. And we don't want to make people wait a long time for the bug fixes to be in what they're downloading and being able to use. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to do monthly releases. As the bug reports diminish off, and as the bugs that we're fixing get harder to fix, then Rakudo Star's focus will be less on rapidly fixing bugs and more on starting to provide stability. Some sort of a deprecation process where you can know when you do a Rakudo Star release, it tells you something about what to expect in the next release 3 months hence, or from the release 3 months prior. So eventually that will be an extended one. And the Star releases are intended for a different audience. The compiler releases are intended for the people who create distributions. The distribution releases, the Star releases, are intended for the people who are writing Perl 6 programs. And so the stability requirements might indicate that a given Star release may choose to use an older compiler because it wants to preserve stability as being more important than being bleeding edge. And I think that's an important feature of having multiple distributions available. So the compiler, we're going to have a fast release cycle, and the goal for the compiler is to stay coupled to the release specification, or to the language specification. Do very fast bug fixes. The compiler will always have a lot of churn. Be working very, very quickly. Performance enhancements, there the compiler is basically saying, what's the best Perl 6 compiler we can write? And backwards compatibility for the compiler is not really an issue other than what the language wants to say backwards compatibility. But distributions will have their own release cycle, and we'll tie those to whatever the audience may need. And there can be multiple distributions. So you take whatever compilers you have a choice of, and whatever modules happen to be available, and documentation, and you map those to your audience. So I can see eventually there being like a scientific edition of Perl 6 or a database edition, where different distributions are focused on different audiences, and they've been tuned for those audiences, but still are able to grab all of the other components of the Perl 6 ecosystem as they need to. So that's where we're going with that. As far as how we decide what goes into any particular release, we're learning that as we go. We can learn a lot from Perl 5. There's a lot of experience and lessons to be learned from Perl 5. We're trying to do things slightly differently than the way Perl 5 has done things traditionally, because we've seen places where the Perl 5 process has traditionally not scaled well, and we're trying to avoid some of those. One thing that we definitely want to avoid is the notion of an official Perl 6, especially as far as implementations go. So there's an official language specification, and it's given by the SNAPs. There is an official test suite that is shared among all the implementations. And for everything else, whenever somebody asks the question, where is the official Perl 6, and put some sort of a noun after it, the answer is almost always, for me, no. And I answer no because it's really the wrong question. So if somebody says, where's the official Perl 6 compiler, my answer is no. If we ask, where is the official Perl 6 distribution, my answer is no. Now there's a new one that I'm going out, which is somebody says, which is the best Perl 6 compiler, I'll say Rakudo. And if somebody says, which is the best Perl 6 distribution, I'll say Rakudo Star. But if you want to know which one's official, I'm going to say no, because there's not such a thing. Where's the official Perl 6 module repository? No. Right? We're going to try and avoid this notion that there's one way to do something. That's for another language. Right? We may have the best, most popular, we may have a lot of other things, but the idea that there's an official central place doesn't really fit in the way that we think about Perl 6 and Rakudo. And so I'll talk more about module repositories in a second, but what we do want to do is seek common interfaces. We have a common language. We want to come up with common, shared APIs, shared ways of doing things, but we don't want to say there's one way to do it. And this is to some extent a change in the tradition of what Perl is going to be doing. I could be wrong about this, about whether or not it would work. The most common comment that I get when I say that there's not an official CPAN is they go, chaos, disaster, nobody will be able to find modules, nobody will be able to find the pieces that they need. And my answer to that is usually C, Unix, and Linux. So everybody knows which one is the official distribution of Linux? Right? Oh, no. Okay, so yeah, where's the official Linux package repositories? You know, so if I want like the GNU compiler, or if I want to have OpenOffice or whatever, what's the central place where all of those are stored? There's not one. So we know that it can work. We know that it's possible to do this thing without having to declare things as official. And so, and it scales well. It seems to scale fairly well in the Linux world. So we're going to try that in the Perl Rakudo world as well. So going to CPAN, right now Rakudo Star does not have the ability to directly use CPAN. We can indirectly use it through a project called Blitzkos. I guess that's how it's pronounced. Is that right, Jonathan? Something like that. Whatever it's called, however you pronounce it, is a way of being able to access the Perl 5 interpreter for Perl 6 programs, and to be able to get access to Perl 5 modules. So you can kind of do that. It's still very experimental to go do that. But we don't have any ability to directly use CPAN. We're not abandoning CPAN. That's not our intent. But we're not yet far enough along in Perl 6 development to really think about how we would work with Perl 5 CPAN, at least at an implementation level. So we're working on some separate ideas for Perl 6, just to get something moving, just to try out some things, to try out some new features over what we've had. The package that we're coming up is called PLS. It stands for PLS Library System. Its most notable characteristic is that you can say, please install something, and it works. It's very nice and friendly, which fits with the rest of the Perl. As part of that, we want to look at the repositories are distributed. There's not a central place. I mean, there could be mirrors and things like that. Multiple transport options. How are we going to deal with authenticating and signing modules, dealing with version modules in ways that the Perl 6 specification requires? So where we stand today, these are the things that we managed to accomplish over the previous year in terms of adding into Perl 6. It's a pretty impressive list. Much more was accomplished this year than I kind of thought we'd be able to do. But that's nice because it fits into under promise, over deliver. Our progress on the test suite has continued to do well also. Everybody always asks what happened with this dip here that caused us to go from way up here and then back up. And one of the things that we discovered late last year as we were doing this is that because of the changes to the way regular expressions and the standard grammar were working, we decided that it was much easier for us to start over in a major way and redesign from scratch and try and port everything across. And so you're seeing the start over point. And we managed to get back up pretty quickly, certainly in time for our release, which was nice. Some known items that are missing from Rakudo Star, we don't have any ability to run Perl 5 code directly. We don't have here docs, but there are some good workarounds. Speed and performance is missing, yeah, okay, right. The ability to handle compact structures, asynchronous I/O. Whatever Perl 5 module you think we really ought to have, we probably don't have it yet, please write it. We don't have, we do have NCI bindings and integration, we can correct that. We don't have the equivalent of uselib, but you can manipulate the ink array yourself. And we still need a lot more documentation. But just because we don't have these things, don't let this stop you from working on it. As Sushi said in June when I was putting an earlier version of this together, emphasize a little that you don't need a complete distribution. You don't need to have everything in Perl 6 to be able to do useful things with it. You can still write modules with it. And that was the point of Rakudo Star. Let's get people starting to write programs so we can find out what's missing and what's important. So what do we want? We want code. We want people to sit down, start using Perl 6, write programs. Because that's where we find out where the bugs are. We want people to write articles. What is it that you did? What worked?